Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Cyclone Chasers update. Today, the 9th of January 2013. We have a lot to get through, so let's get straight into it. First thing we need to talk about is tropical cyclone or severe tropical cyclone Narelle, who is now category 3. It started its drift towards the south-southwest today and will continue to make that its movement for the next 24 to 48 hours before starting a more southwest to west-southwest drift again as it heads very close to the northwest coast of WA. That's the big news tonight, so the next number of minutes will be devoted to TC Narelle. Then we'll talk about the Coral Sea Low, then we'll talk about the NT Low. So we've got a lot to get through, so let's get in. Okay, looking at the latest Joint Typhoon Warning Centre extended forecast track, we can see the system is tracking well to the west of Exmouth. The closest it actually gets is about 170 nautical miles to the west of Exmouth. Doesn't actually get anywhere near the coast according to this map, but we still see a fairly large error margin here that the system can still hit as far east as Karratha and as far west as well west of the Western Australian mainland. So definitely not a set-in-stone track, and we do need to be aware of the error margin. We'll talk about why and what models are showing this error margin happening. Alrighty, so that's where it is, and this is where it's going to go, and this is the intensity. So Cat 2, Cat 3, Cat 3. This is a Saffir-Simpson scale, so it's a little bit different to what we use here in Australia. This is a more recognisable scale used around the world than what we use. So even though it's showing Cat 3, it is the equivalent of a low-end Cat 4 on our system. This was the latest ASCAT pass of the system earlier today. And around about lunchtime today, we could see already by lunchtime today, we have these orange barbs. These orange barbs are showing us intensity of a category 2 or category 1 hurricane in here. So we're well and truly looking at a category 2 or 3 tropical cyclone by about lunchtime today. So we can see here we've got 40, 45, even 55, 60 knot sustained winds in the close to the center of the system. That's what these orange barbs. And you can see very clear rotation here. Really nice satellite pass there right over the top of the system. The latest satellite we've got makes it a little bit difficult to pinpoint a middle, but overall we'd suggest that the middle is probably around about there. We see the system developing some very tall thunderstorm clouds, and we can see an eye starting to appear there. And when we go into the shortwave imagery of the infrared, we see the eye in there. And we see slightly displaced convection to the west, still under a little bit of wind shear, but nowhere near as much as it has had. And once again, we see that the eye right in there. And in water vapor imagery, you can just make out there the development of an eye on the system itself. The latest look at the visible imagery that we had, we could see here the really tall thunderstorm clouds associated with the eye wall just displaced to the west of the eye. So we can see here very, very clearly. This is the last one we had. It was about 3 hours ago now, 4 hours after by the time this video comes out. And we can really see some nice banding, spiral banding coming through. Very nice looking system for a Cat 2, Cat 3 system. Alright, so over the next 24 hours, it's heading into continued very, very nice conditions. So this is the wind shear overlay. Over the next 24 hours, we see it going through 10 knots of wind shear, which really shouldn't affect a growing system. It should be free to continue to grow based on shear analysis. If we take a quick look longer term, the system tracks into, over the next 2 to 3 days, reasonably good conditions. There is a little bit of shear happening here though, 20 to 30 knots in this region to the north of the Pilbara coastline, but it is there, and the system will probably have to track through it. And so it may weaken it slightly, but it's unlikely to weaken it much, if at all, because as this system pushes to the southwest, we expect that shear to also push east, and we expect it to continue to travel through reasonably good environmental conditions all the way through to being west of the northwest coast. When we start talking upper level divergence, we talked about what this was two days ago, and that was all about getting rid of the waste products of its thunderstorms. So once the thunderstorms build, we need to get rid of that upper level cloud so we can build new storms underneath it, and we see it's going to track into a very, very favorable area here over the next 24 to 48 hours. So we might see rapid intensification of this system, and we've already started to see that as it tracks through, but we might see rapid intensification here over the next 24 to 48 hours. Okay, this is a slightly deeper steering flow than there was yesterday. We can still see that the flow overall is westerly, but the system's developing such depth that we've got to take a closer look at the steering flow above this level. So let's have a look at, even though this is the official steering flow, it's not going to follow this steering flow, purely and simply because it's grown so much in the last 6 to 12 hours that a whole new level is going to take control of this system. Let's have a look at. When we take a look at the region-wide view of what's the steering influence in the higher levels of the atmosphere, we see this big upper anticyclone here. Now, this big upper anticyclone is trying to push it west for all its money. So it's trying to keep this off the coast. Now, if that big upper anticyclone stays in place, most of the models have it pushing a little bit further to the east over the next couple of days, and that's going to allow the system to push a little bit further to the south rather than west. But if the system then comes back into this area, there is absolutely no way this thing can hit the coast if that system remains in place. Now, this is the doubt though. That system is set to push a little bit east. We see an upper level trough here. If you look at this little jut of winds pushing up northwards, we see an upper level trough here amplifying on the western edge of that ridge. Now, what that upper level trough will do is it'll break down or erode that ridge. Now, if it erodes it enough, it will push the system further to the south rather than southwest. Now, if it doesn't erode it enough, the high remains in place. It remains a fairly strong steering influence, and the system will track to the southwest, or initially a little bit further south, because it doesn't have that much of an influence on it now, but it will have an influence on it in 24, maybe 48 hours, and start to drift it west again, well off the coastline. So that's the only doubt we've got really with this system, is that if this high decides to, and highs in the upper levels can be a little bit less predictable than, say, upper level troughs. So with a high in the upper levels, sometimes it can weaken out pretty rapidly, and if it does weaken out pretty rapidly and the models don't see it coming, it completely changes the track of this cyclone. At this stage, based on that kind of pattern there, with the high blocking the cyclone's passage southwards, it's only going to drift south for another 24 hours or so before it starts to push to the southwest, assuming, remember, that this upper level trough doesn't erode the ridge completely. If it erodes the ridge completely, then we start talking impact on the northwest coast. But at this stage, we're not expecting that. This trough is not expected to amplify too much. It's not expected to kill this ridge off completely. It may weaken it, and that's why we expect it to move south, but it won't weaken it enough, and the high will rebuild, or this is what it's expected to do. The high will rebuild, and based on that steering flow, will then start to push the system back to the southwest or west-southwest again as it gets a little bit closer to the coast. That's what it's expected to do, but cyclones, very unexpected. They can do whatever they want sometimes, and we just can't predict. If we look at whether or not dry air might affect this system, we see a nice, really good swirl here on the precipitable water imagery. But if we look at where it's going to head into an area of continually wet conditions or moist conditions throughout all levels of the atmosphere. There is a little bit of dry air out here, but it's well west of the circulation. Shouldn't really impact the circulation. Off your screen to the southwest, it gets quite dry, and that will aid in its weakening once it gets south of 20, 21, 22 degrees south, along with the cooler waters. But for the time being, there's absolutely no problem with where it's tracking in terms of moisture. Alright, now let's look at some strike probabilities. Okay, if we have a look at where the GFS model and ensemble puts this, it develops, or it's already developed here, and it's continuing to push to the west-southwest for a little while longer before it pushes southwards, and then southwest, and then south-southwest, and south. Basically, just the entire track of it is southwest. Now, the entire model, all of its members are in very, very tight agreement, and we don't often see that tight agreement with one model and its ensemble. We've only got one member that actually hits the coast. Another member grazes the coast out here after the Northwest Cape. Most of them, or pretty well all of them, unanimously keep this off the coast, and yeah, just tracking continually to the southwest. Maybe the remnants of the system may attach itself to a trough or get affected by a trough and push off into WA and give it a bit of rain, but the system itself remaining well offshore using the GFS on. Now, in saying that, the Canadian model continues to smack the coast with this, and almost every Canadian model member has this thing whacking into Karratha, Karratha to Onslow. So, you know, as much as we say the GFS tight agreement, the European is now becoming a lot tighter in its agreement, but the Canadian model is just still very insistent on whacking this into the coast. It has that, remember how we talked about that upper level ridge or that upper level high? It has that completely eroding, an upper level trough taking its place, and the system just drifting south in front of that trough, being quite an intense system as well, by the way, looking at a Cat 4 on impact with land, according to the Canadian. It's a highly doubtful forecast, but it obviously needs to be, you know, talked about at least, because if that high that I talked about here decides that it's just going to cave in, or it's going to move further to the east over southern Queensland or southern Northern Territory instead of WA, then it becomes a little bit trickier, the situation and the steering flow. At this stage, this is really the only model that suggests that to us. So we do have to be a bit skeptical of whether this track forecast will come off. And at this stage, I would say it's a highly doubtful track forecast, but it is there. Members are in reasonably tight agreement that it's going to be approaching or whacking into the coast. The UK model's also getting pretty reasonably keen, or it's been always keen for a coastal crossing. Now it's still reasonably keen for a crossing, but on the far, far western Cape. So, look, we do have to say that despite most of the guidance keeping this offshore, and even with the UK, most of the guidance keeps it just offshore, but we really do have to talk about the possibility of an impact, because there are still model members that are suggesting an impact, particularly anywhere sort of west of Onslow. Karratha's a far eastern outlier at the moment, but anywhere sort of west of Onslow, there is still a fairly, not a good chance, but there is still a chance there. And look, the probabilities of it actually crossing the coast, its centre of circulation crossing the coast, are down to about 10 to 20% now. But the probabilities of gale force winds are up still around 50% plus to this area here. So there is still a fairly good chance that even though the cyclone will pass to the west of the actual coastline and won't cross, that you will still get some very strong winds, possibly even some damaging wind gusts in that. So there is that likelihood we need to be aware of. So even though, don't get lulled into a false sense of security, if the cyclone passes just to the west, you're still going to see a very large wind field to its east and southeast and south. So this is the Euro on Saturday, and we can see there's still a little bit of disagreement inside the Euro as to where this system will lie Saturday. It's got it, you know, the outliers of the Euro have it pretty close to Barrow Island, whereas the general consensus of the model has it well to the west of that. But you still have those outliers, and I mean, you know, we still need to pay attention to some of those outliers, because their scenarios sometimes do come off. Doesn't happen often, but when it happens and we don't pay attention to it, that's when we can land ourselves into trouble. So there are some outliers still going for a crossing just on the far western coast. Most of the model members are pushing this well to the west of the northwest coast. If we track through to Sunday, we can see that pretty clearly then. The model's suggesting there that it will pass just to the west. But once again, we do have those outliers that cross it right around the Exmouth area. But overall, fairly good consensus now from the European, and the European's fairly accurate that this thing's going to pass to the west. Maybe not completely harmlessly. It will cause a fair bit of rain and will cause some gale force winds, but thankfully the destructive and very destructive core not likely to affect the northwest at this point in time. Remember, as we said though, it all hinges on that high and whether that high or that ridge erodes on the western flank. If that does happen, then we might be talking a different tune in a couple of days' time. And by Monday, we've got a few lines of thought there. We could have the low or the cyclone just off the northwest coast. We could have it well off the northwest coast, and we could have it even further off the northwest coast. It is a very highly doubtful forecast when we start going out to 5 days and there's a cyclone around. so we won't talk too much about that. Interestingly, we're going to divert our attention now. That's enough on Narelle. We're going to divert our attention up here to the north and northern Coral Sea. So let's start from today. So today and tomorrow morning we see a few little areas of interest along a bit of a trough line here in the Coral Sea. This is one little area of interest off the PNG. This is another little sucker of a spot here that's just developed over the last few hours. Just a very, very tight little rotation has just formed here in the Gulf of Papua, and the model's very, very interested in this for the next 12 hours or so before it completely weakens it off. So if we look at that little sucker tonight, it's sort of just developing in the Gulf of Papua there, a very, very tight little rotation. Only this model's picked up on it. At the moment, if we look at the satellite image, we're starting to see a really, really tight clustering of thunderstorms just here in the far northern Coral Sea. It's very difficult to tell if there's any real rotation to them, but there's some very intense storm activity happening just in there in the Gulf of Papua. So that's perhaps what the model's picked up on and decided to spin it into what looks to be a very near tropical cyclone overnight tonight. So it's definitely a coup to the model if it's picked this very tight area of convection. Whether or not it actually becomes a tropical cyclone in the next 12 hours is highly doubtful, but the fact that the model can pick it up so well is certainly something we do need to commend that model for. But you can definitely see that the model was onto something. We're seeing some very, very strong convection, extremely strong convection just here in the Gulf of Papua. And I'll tell you what, if it does form into a bit of a low, it would not surprise me in that current condition that it's in. It will pose absolutely no threat whatsoever to the Queensland coast if it did decide to spin up overnight, and it would push very quickly or reasonably quickly out to the east-southeast or southeast and eventually weaken due to wind shear as it heads further out in the Coral Sea. But very, very interesting little phenomenon. Now let's talk about the other low, the low that the bomb's looking at, and the low that all the models have picked up on. So this is a look at the GFS. Now the GFS has picked up that area of convergence too, but it's not really spinning it into anything. If we compare that with the European tonight, which has spun it into something fairly significant overnight tonight. So it just goes to show the difference in the models, even at a lead time of just 12 hours. So overnight tonight, we see a low spinning here. This is the one that the Bureau is. By tomorrow morning, we see it spinning away quite nicely to the east of Cairns. And then as we head through to Friday morning, we see it's still spinning around, but it's still not showing any real signs of deepening or development. And if we take a look then by Friday night, we continue to see the low here, still not showing any real signs of formation or development. And the first thing we look for, obviously, at the moment in the Coral Sea, being the way it is wind shear, and we can see that the system is tracking under 20 and even 30 to 40 knots of wind shear around it, so that is going to hold it back. If anything else doesn't, the wind shear will definitely hold it back from forming, especially out here in the central or northern Coral Sea. If it stays well to the north, then there's a slight chance of it developing. The other thing that's going to hold it back is, look at this, so much dry air. This is the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, and this is in the percentage relative humidity from the surface or from the lower levels, 850 hectopascals, all the way up. And really, cyclones to form, they need this blue, light blue, dark blue sort of colouring, 60% plus of moisture in the atmosphere. The whole western Coral Sea is dry as a bone over the next 3, 5, even 7 days. Really, we're looking at a very, very dry western Coral Sea. So the fact that there's no moisture out there is going to limit any chance of tropical cyclone development, really, for at least the next 3 days. But look, if it can form way up here to the north near the Solomons or between the Solomons and PNG, there's nothing holding it back. It's very nice wind shear, very nice moisture levels. The problem is that the rotation or the circulation seems to be wanting to move further to the southeast in an area of less than favourable conditions over the next 3 to 4 days. Now, the good thing about the Coral Sea is it is going to change. The wind shear is going to die off, and if we look a little bit ahead, we'll start to see that wind shear dying off by around about Monday or Tuesday next week, we do start to see the wind shear. Notice how it's pushing a lot further to the east. Most of the western Coral Sea then has very little wind shear come Monday night. And we see that general pattern of this wind shear just dying off and allowing the Coral Sea to become a spawning ground again, starting again, at least anywhere to the north of Cairns. We see that shear dying off. And the other thing we see, interestingly, in the Coral Sea over the next week is a change in the steering flow, especially towards the western parts of the Coral Sea. The upper level winds start to change. They start to become lighter, or they start to become easterlies due to an upper level ridge over central Australia. But still, the northern Coral Sea, if anything forms up here to the north, it's going to want to track out to the east. So really, the things change for the central and southern and western Coral Sea, but if you go to the far northern Coral Sea, anything that develops out here or develops near the Solomons and tries to track in will get whisked away to the east again before managing to get to the coast, at least for the next 7 days or so. So look, as much as it is changing and it is improving, we still have this anomalous westerly flow throughout this region. So on Friday morning, we see an area of low pressure here in the far eastern Coral Sea. That's the low that we're tracking at the moment over the central, likely to have pushed a little bit further to the east. But then there's also just general lower pressure here throughout the region. And so that means that low may or may not track that way. If it stays reasonably weak and shallow, it may even track back to the west. So that's by Friday morning. By Saturday morning, we see, as I said, that flow does start to change. So we see that lower area of pressure, or lower pressure area, pushing back towards the west. Remember, if it's still in the northern Coral Sea, it'll continue to push east. But if it's back into the central Coral Sea, it may push west. But also remember that this time there's still a lot of wind shear here, so not likely to develop into a tropical cyclone at that stage. But potential is there for the low to still be alive, and in the longer term, if it is still alive, it may kick into something later on. By Sunday, seems to weaken out a fair bit into just a general trophy area. The other area then that we're starting to watch is just here off the northern or far northern parts of the top end, and in the Arafura Sea, maybe even the Eastern Timor Sea, is where we shift our focus come Sunday. On Monday, if the Coral Sea low is still alive, it's getting close to the peninsula. If not, then we just see a general trophy area up here. We also see general low pressure, but not really it's more so a monsoon trough that's actually now hitting the coast here at the top end and bringing in a fair bit of rain, hopefully early to mid next week. And then come Tuesday, that's when we're starting to see another low possibly forming out here in the Timor Sea to the west of Darwin. And once again, this one will need to be watched for further development. At this very early stage, that next low looks to be tracking not too dissimilar to Tropical Cyclone Narelle, except probably a little further to the southwest as opposed to the west-southwest at the time. There's no really big high in here at that time. At least the model projections at the moment suggest not. So the low is likely to track a little bit more southwest. This is the next one we'll be watching for the northwest, but it starts at the top end and hopefully will give the top end a bit of rain, because they've really been wanting a bit of rain. The monsoon trough, you could almost taste it, but it's just not quite getting to the mainland. Hopefully this will be the catalyst if it can develop close enough to the top end coast to bring that monsoon trough down onto the top end coast. At the moment, still pretty doubtful as to whether it can do it, but it is a promising sign in the longer term. I know we're looking a long way ahead now, and we're just doing it just for a bit of a laugh, but by here next Thursday we've got some modelling suggesting possibly even a tropical cyclone, a weak one developing well north of the Pilbara coastline. Once again, this is by next Thursday. And just for a bit of fun, that's what's happening by next Saturday. So this is a long way ahead now. But we are looking at ensemble forecasting, which does have a higher success rate than just a standard look at a model. So we do have the potential there of seeing that lower cyclone off the Pilbara coastline. We also, interestingly, start to look at the development of a very large trophy type region here over the Gulf, over the peninsula, may signal the onset of the monsoon. May also signal the onset of a low pressure system developing in the southeastern Gulf. And look, some of the longer term modelling suggests that a low may develop here in the southeast Gulf, may finally bring some rain to Queensland, but that's so far ahead that we're really getting ahead of ourselves talking about it. But it is something to look forward to, and we always try to look forward to some good news for areas. And look, the top end might get some good news early to mid next week with the development of a low, and the Queensland area might get some good news early to mid the week after, with the development of a Gulf low, or maybe even a Western Coral Sea low. Not quite sure yet, it's too far away. The northwest probably needs to be on the lookout for another tropical low or cyclone sometime in the next week or two as well. So Narelle's going to push at this stage just to the west. A new low or cyclone may form in a week or two's time in the Timor Sea, push towards the southwest at this stage. Not quite sure on longer term direction, obviously. And then we also are watching the Coral Sea over the next few days, but not much is going to happen with that one, we would think. But, you know, the Coral Sea is the most unpredictable basin in the world. No one can really predict more than 2 or 3 days ahead in the Coral Sea because it is very unpredictable. There's a lot of byplay happening between a lot of different weather systems, and just how they interact can determine how quickly. I mean, look at that little thing off PNG. No one would have picked it except for that European model that's picked this massive area, or very localized area, sorry, of extreme convection, and no one else picked it. So that's the sort of thing the Coral Sea does. It keeps you guessing, and we can't look too far ahead in the Coral Sea. Alright folks, thanks very much for watching. We'll have another update for you tomorrow night.